Hey guys, I happened to see audio wizard John Sanfilippo online in LinkedIn. Loved his branding, loved his sound brand, which we'll get into. And so invited John on the show. And John kind of I guess explain what it is that you do with Soundwise and what sonic branding is.
Yeah, so I am in the business of sonic branding, also called audio branding. We use the
Yeah.
terms interchangeably, and it works very similar to how you would approach the visual component of branding. And I think everybody's pretty familiar with visual branding. You have consistent logo, color, typeface. I'm doing essentially the same thing, but with music, voice, and sound. And it's a really interesting time to be in this line of work
Hmm.
because there is so much audio media that's just blowing up these days. I mean, podcasting, that's a
Totally.
huge one. And streaming content and voice interface and all this other stuff, in addition to all of the audio media that's out there already. So a lot of businesses and a lot of brands have been hyper visual for their entire
Hmm.
existence. And if all of your brand assets are visual and you find yourself in an audio only medium, none of those assets carry over.
No,
So when you can't see the brand, you have to be able to hear the brand. And that's basically where I come in. Yeah.
I love that phrase because I think that to me, when I read that, I was like, oh, that makes total sense. Like it just kind of solidified the concept for me. And so I also saw your term brand anthem, and that was intriguing to me. And so, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, that's not necessarily my term, but
Okay.
it refers to this idea of creating a musical composition that becomes part of your brand identity. And usually it culminates to what we might call an audio logo or a jingle or
Ooh,
something like that,
yeah.
some sort of sonic signature that we use to brand ourselves with. So, for example, there's one we just wrapped up a few weeks ago. It hasn't launched yet, probably by the time this podcast is out, but that was one where we went through the whole process of creating not just an audio signature, but there was a whole composition
Oh,
associated
wow.
with it. And it's great because once you have that, you're able to kind of distill it and break it down into different elements and disseminate it to all of your different touch points and media and even environments in some cases.
That is so cool. And I think like sound is a hard thing to explain because it's like an intangible. So it's like, how best can you share the places where a company would use sound, like you said, an audio logo? Like, where does it play in when it comes to the marketing pieces?
Yeah, well, you're very right. Sound is very difficult. And I think that's part of the reason why we're so visually focused with branding
Yeah.
because sights are very apparent. They're very in your face. People have the vocabulary to describe them.
Right.
Whereas with sound, it's much more challenging. Most people, people like music and sound is obviously part of their lives, but they don't always know how to describe it. They don't know how to articulate what they like and what they don't like and that sort of thing. So a lot of the time I'm kind of serving as a sort of translator and trying to kind of guess what people are after. And a lot of the time, you sort of look to examples as well. And the great thing about doing this kind of work nowadays is there's so much like stock music out there. There's so much
Yeah.
media out there that you can find sort of examples and templates to sort of guide the discussion. So yeah, there's that. But in terms of media, yeah, a lot of brands, most brands have a lot more sonic touch points than they realize. And when we go through the process, I tend to start with what I like to call the audio audit. So we'll look at the brand and try to get a sense of how much sound they're actually making already. And
Oh.
then ask ourselves how much of it was designed and how much of it can be designed. Because
Mm.
and people will always say, you get a lot of pushback. They're like, well, what sort of ROI do you get from having a sonic identity? And my response is usually, well, what sort of ROI do you get from having a visual identity? It's not about the medium itself. It's
Right.
about using best practices to get the most out of the media you're already producing. And a lot of people don't really have a handle on their sound. They think, oh, it's just for our radio ad or something like that. Well, that's a good starting point, but
Yeah.
you probably have web video, you probably have UX and UI sounds, you probably have phone automation, and that's a big one because the
Mm,
phone tends to be the worst part of the customer experience. And
right.
partly because nobody calls their own business. They don't have any
No,
idea
it's an
how
afterthought.
awful they have no idea how awful that experience is. So yeah, we want to get a sense of, yeah, how much media are we actually putting out, and then how do we put our own sort of signature on it?
And really, it's like when you think of music in general, like it invokes a feeling and it does to me, it like invokes like memories or it makes me act a certain way. If it's like really upbeat, I want to dance or whatever it may be, it can really impact you in a bigger way than I think as an entrepreneur we tend to intentionally think about.
Yeah, and that's very much the power of sound, and I don't mean to make it sound like sound and visuals are rivals. They're very
Yeah.
much complementary, but to highlight some of the advantages of sound, even if you want to get to like a down to sort of the neuroscience of it. Uh, Sight tends to stay in its own part of the brain. It's a very power hungry part of the brain, but it very
Yeah.
much stays in the visual cortex. Whereas sound, its pathways are very broad and they intersect with what you're talking about, things like emotion and
Mhm.
memory. So it's a very, very powerful sense and subsequent medium to work with. Yeah, absolutely.
So, narrowing down to podcasting here for a minute. So,
Mhm.
naturally, when I think of audio or sound for a podcast, I think of the intro and the outro and the music that podcasters choose for their show. Um, and I know for me, when I've worked with clients for launches, they've picked a couple of songs, and I'm like, ooh, like a hard rock when you're like a professional, I don't know, psychologist or something. Like
Mhm.
that's such a disconnect for me, like in what you're doing. Like, what are some of the mistakes that you think podcasters make and how can they fix it?
Well, that's the first one right there is choosing music based on your own preference and
Yeah.
not by the brand you're trying to build. And it could be like a multi-million dollar company, or it can be just a one person operation
Hmm.
and just a podcast. You still have an audio identity, and that's the other thing I try to impress upon people is you have a sonic identity whether you've designed it or not.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that the identity you're creating is congruent with who you actually are. So I'll take this back a few steps. So with the process, when we sit down with a brand, we sit down with a client and try to put this all together,
Hmm.
we go through this process where we try to get to the guts of what they actually are. And I
Nice.
find you have to dig a little deeper with sound than you do with visuals, because quite
Yeah.
often visuals convey information, but sounds convey emotion, as you alluded
Yeah.
to earlier. So we go through this process where like I said, we try to get to the guts of what they are on an emotional level. And we'll usually boil it down to maybe like 3 to 5 core attributes. And then ask ourselves, how does that translate into music, sound, and voice? So you can kind of go through a little bit of that process on your own. If you're a podcaster and maybe you're like a 1 or 2 person show, it helps if you have someone like myself to kind of guide you. But
God,
most
yeah.
people don't have the budget for that, especially if they're starting out in podcasting. So what I would suggest that you do is try to really objectify what you're doing and how you want to come across. And don't do it again based on your own musical preferences,
Yeah.
but get a sense of who we are and how we want to present ourselves, and then try to find or create, if you have the option, music that falls in line with that. You want to create a sense of congruency
Yeah.
between all of the sounds that you're putting out, and even something like the host's voice. You might even start with that, because
Hmm.
voices are incredibly diverse and
You have a good
very.
radio voice, by the way, John.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That's how I actually got started. I started about 20 years ago in radio, and it was just kind of a natural progression from there. Yeah.
Awesome.
But look at what you're doing and how you actually want to come across. And yeah, one of the biggest mistakes you can make is picking music based on your own personal preferences. And yeah, you alluded to this earlier. I hear so many podcasts where there is that incongruency, and they'll start off one way, and then as soon as the host talks, it just falls off a cliff, right? So
Yeah.
you want to create that again, that congruency and that immersion. A few other things. Some people, they tend to gravitate toward established music. Even brands, like big brands, you see all kinds of commercials where they'll use pop songs in
Yeah.
commercials. And I try to dissuade people from doing that for a few
Hmm.
reasons. For one thing, it's very, very expensive.
Very.
There's all kinds of legalities to go through. But the big thing is you can't take any ownership of that. It will never really be your song or your
Yeah.
music. And that's the other tricky thing, going back to selecting, if we're talking about stock music. The great thing about stock music is there's so much of it now, and the quality is so high. Like when I was, in school, you were embarrassed to use stock music because
Yeah,
it
I
was
know,
crap,
right?
right? But there's so much of it out there, and it's so good. The only problem is, again, you can't take any ownership of it. And even with big budget brands and commercials, I see the same, or hear the same stock music being
Hmm.
used. I
Really?
remember last year I saw this Chevy truck commercial, and it had the kind of music you'd expect. It's that big sort of bluesy rock kind of
Yeah,
thing. And I
yeah.
was like, oh, that's cool. But then I heard that exact same track in a Cracker Barrel cheese commercial like 3
No.
months later. Yeah. And it happens a lot. There was another one I noticed in Kingston. Here we had there was a tourism campaign that used this one track, and it was actually really good. I was like, oh, this is cool. Yeah. But then I heard it in a Shoppers Drug Mart commercial a few months
Oh,
later.
wow.
And yeah, it happens a lot. So it's tricky. If you have the means to create custom music, that is the best route. Because yeah, when you do have that thing that happens where the stock music is heard somewhere else, like you could use a track for like a few years, and to the listener, that becomes your music.
Right.
But once they hear it somewhere else, the illusion is lost, and you lose
Yeah.
a little bit of your credibility there. Yeah.
And I like what you said in it's kind of like that brand recognition. So like when you hear, for lack of better terms, a jingle for, I don't know, I can't think of any right now, but Coca-Cola, don't they have one? McDonald's, obviously, that's the big one, where
Mhm.
you hear that sound, like, and oh, that's McDonald's. You don't have to see anything, you don't have to, it's just that instant recognition. Um, which is so cool. And so that is part of their brand again, and that recognition without having to see something. I mean, that's powerful.
Well, and that's the thing I'm always telling my clients, and I think you basically nailed it right there. I'm always telling them we want to create something that is so distinctive and so consistent and so us that you could remove your name from your ad and still be recognized.
Yeah,
And you can
yeah.
totally do that. And I like to use audio visual analogies because, again, we like visuals. You see that visually all the time, where you'll see visual logos where they just pare everything down, right? They'll get rid of the name, they'll get rid of the ornaments, they'll go monochromatic, and that's a big power move. You can't necessarily do that right away, but like McDonald's, I mean, they don't need to write McDonald's. You see the golden arches and you know
Totally.
who it is. Yeah, and they do the same thing sonically. McDonald's has always been so well branded visually and sonically, but that's really what you want to do. You want to have that consistency and
Mhm.
that distinctiveness, that to the point where your brand is just so strong that you can, you know, go minimalist and still be recognized.
So how when you're working with a client, like how do you create like a sound style guide? And like, yeah, ask the second question after that. I want to overwhelm you. What is yeah, what is that, and like what what is it made up of?
Yeah, well, it's we've touched on it a little bit already. So
Okay.
we'll identify some of those key traits that we want to express, and we'll outline how they translate into music, voice, and sound. So there'll be sort of the do's and don'ts,
Right.
basically, of instrumentation and genre and things like
Right.
that, and even the voice. We'll put a very fine point on the spoken voice and even the written voice to a
Okay.
certain degree, but the spoken voice is certainly more my specialty. Where, you know, is it male or female? Is it old? Is it
Right.
young? Is it authoritative? Is it effervescent? There are so many fine points you can put on a voice, and even things like accent, and we even talk about things like key words, like signature words. For example,
Hmm.
like Disney, everything's magic, magic, magic everywhere, right? So
Right.
we'll look at that too. It's like, are there any sort of signature words that we want to try to own in our branding? You know, what that can be associated with who we are. So yeah, we look at voice, we look at music, and just putting a really fine point on all those things, and we create some sort of sonic signature, usually something melodic, right? Like you talked about McDonald's, they have their ba da ba ba ba, which is,
Yeah.
that's their thing, right? So we'll usually create some sort of melody, and from the melody you create a grander composition. Usually you
Oh,
talked about
okay.
the brand anthem. Yeah, so it's all just building from the ground up, and then we'll outline how all these, because we build assets. So we have a voice, we have a sonic signature of some sort, we have a bigger musical composition, and then we outline how these assets that we've developed are disseminated to all of our media touch points and environments. Yeah.
That's so cool. And so when I'm just thinking about the like sonic assets that you call them. So if you were working with a client and you created like their podcast intro, outro, like so therefore that piece of music, if you will, or those sounds, you can use those in other elements in of your marketing so that you're more cohesive.
Yeah, I always tell people, if what we create lives and dies in one medium, then we've failed. The
Ooh,
whole idea is you want to create, like I talked about, consistency and everything else, but we want to have some flexibility too. And the great thing about these sonic assets is they are flexible and they can be
yeah.
adapted to different media. And that's one of the things that I think we learned during COVID, and we learned it the hard way. Is in the early days of COVID, there was a funny thing that happened where every commercial was exactly the same. And if you don't believe me, there's a clip on YouTube called "Every COVID Commercial is Exactly the Same."
Oh my God,
And
really?
yeah, it's brilliant, and they lay it all out. And there is a pattern that developed where they all
Interesting.
started with this kind of somber piano music, and they'd show you footage of empty warehouses and empty stores and empty factories, and then the voiceover comes on and says, "In these troubled times, in these unprecedented times, in these uncertain times."
So true.
Yeah, and then they would build a little bit. There was this sort of semi-inspirational kind of tone that it would take. And
Yeah.
then they do this, you know, since 19 blah blah blah. We've been there for you and we always will. And then
Yes.
it just culminates to a reveal of a logo. And it could have been any logo at the end of that commercial. So what the reason I bring that up is it was so indicative of a brand's sort of superficial relationship with itself. because again, with sound you have to dig deeper to get to that
Mm-hmm.
emotional core if you're going to express yourself properly using sound and music and voice. So the ones that did it right were the ones that had an established sonic identity, and they were able to
Mm-hmm.
switch, they were able to change gears emotionally. And one of the ones that did it really well was State Farm. You know, everybody knows like a good neighbor, State Farm. Yeah. All they had to do was just take that existing composition and just tone it down a little, just pull it back, right? It's the same thing, it
Right.
just has a different emotional tone. So what you get is a commercial or a brand identity or whatever that um, was relevant to the changed social climate, but still on brand. It was still authentic
Right.
to what you were doing. Yeah, and that's the big thing these days. um I'm going a little off topic here, but I think it's still relevant. uh Everything's all about authenticity these days,
So true.
and you can go extra deep with that with sound. And it's it's very much like in personal relationships. You know, the more authentic you are and the more you are in touch with who you are, the deeper the relationship you can build with other people. And it works the same way in business. The more you know who you are, the more
Mm-hmm.
the deeper the relationship you have with yourself, the better you can build that relationship long term with the public, because you're presenting your most authentic self. And that's another thing I think we learned in COVID as well. I was having a conversation with a radio sales rep recently, and he was talking about some car dealerships that you know, there was supply chain issues. They weren't as able to get product on the lot as they normally would, and they were saying, where is everybody? Like, you know, we're out there, we're in the community, we support local sports teams and things. And he said, yeah, but that's not the image that you've built, because car dealers are notorious for these, you know, sort of outrageous come for the sale sort of ads.
Yep.
And a lot of businesses, they get really hooked on those quick upticks in sales with,
Yep.
you know, promotions. They don't think long term in terms of branding. So
Right.
now I sort of reference that dynamic now when we're having these conversations about authenticity. Is okay, well, look at the crazy car dealer. Like, they want to be known as the everyman. If you want to look at brand archetypes, it's like, okay, we wanted to be the everyman, but we were the jester instead, and now it's coming back
Yeah.
to haunt us.
I know it's interesting to see the changes over time, but also like the impact, like if your branding is done wrong, like the impact of like, okay, the times change, but your brand is not irrelevant, but like it's just not, it's missing the mark with people.
Well, there was I was talking to a colleague of mine who's also in this business. They did. It's interesting. In the finance world, there's a lot more sonic branding now. A lot of the big
Oh.
banks in Canada have sonic assets, and they did one of the major banks, and they were talking about how they were, you know, same process. They're like, okay, let's look at what are our values, what are those traits we want
Hmm.
to express. And they went through that process, but then they found that it didn't really match the visual logo anymore,
Oh,
because they had
interesting.
the logo that they had, I won't say who it was,
Yeah.
but the logo that they had was very, very old. And yeah, there was just this incongruity between the visual identity they
Yeah.
had and the sonic identity they were trying to create.
Yeah. So interesting. All the different layers, right?
Hmm.
So when you're making your, because again, it's kind of like in podcasters' faces, they're thinking about the intros and the outros and the music.
Yeah.
Is there like any tips that you would give? Like, is there a length that's too long? Or like when you're creating these sonic assets, are there certain guidelines that you need to like stick to? Or is it everyone's different?
Yeah, that's tricky. I think it really comes down to kind of what I was saying about really take a hard look in the mirror. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's really hard to
It is.
objectify your own business or your own brand. I always say that there are two points of view on any business. There's the way you see your business, and there's the way the rest of the world sees your business. It's really hard to look at it objectively, but yeah, I would say start with just try to get a sense of who you are and what you want to express, and also if you've been doing a podcast for a long time,
Mhm.
listen to your podcast, see what kind of vibes you're already giving off, rather than trying to
Yeah.
sort of artificially create it. And I think that can kind of set the tone as well. Yeah.
Do you ever do like polls, or you know how some companies do the I forget what you call it, but you bring people in and they like review your commercials and
Like a
your
focus group
branding
or
and
something,
what's that?
like a focus group.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, I don't personally, but
Yeah.
one of the great things about this business actually is we have data now in the
Yeah.
digital age. And when I was in radio, uh, you had kind of a general sense of what was working and what wasn't, but a lot of the time it really was kind of a lot of educated guesswork.
Hmm.
I hate to say, but yeah, we have companies now that are dedicated to figuring out, what works in terms of
Yeah.
sound and music. And there's all kinds of data coming out now. Like something I alluded to earlier, we've learned that music really is a universal language, because people will
Hmm.
talk about demographics in music and they'll say, okay, well, okay, here's another mistake people often make is we talked already about applying your own tastes to your
Yeah.
brand. The other mistake is applying the perceived tastes of your audience, actually. And this is something that surprises people, I think. But it really just comes back to, like I said, getting to the core of what you do and expressing it. Because, yeah, people will respond to music regardless, as long as it is authentic. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. And yeah, you don't want to put something out that A is generic, but B also, yeah, like what you think people want to hear. It's just, you know, you're throwing spaghetti on against a wall and hoping it sticks.
Yeah, it's a lot of guesswork, and it's just bad positioning where when you're second guessing yourself. If you
Yeah.
again, if you have a really solid feeling of who you are and how you want to express yourself, then yeah, it's you're hitting the ground running. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, how can people find out about your company and how you can help them create their own sonic anthem or their intros or outros?
Yeah, everything is on my website, soundwise.audio. There's links to social media, there's the process, there's samples of previous work that we've done,
Yeah,
and the blog. The blog, I try to publish maybe monthly. It doesn't always work out that way. It's just
I
depending
hear
on
you.
how busy I am. But a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about is elaborated on in the blog as well.
Perfect. And I love again when you put out your sound on LinkedIn. I was like, "Oh my God, that's so good." And yeah, just hearing those examples, it kind of solidifies like what it means and the impact of it. So, yeah, thanks for sharing your wisdom.
Yes, thank you, Lindsay.
All right, have a good one, guys.